Hey guys, welcome to Gods Will Be Gods. I'm Cameron Smith. I'm going to start this episode with just a few remarks on the idea of philosophical pessimism, as opposed to just run-of-the-mill pessimism. I think that'll help kind of set the stage for the rest of the episode. And part of the motivation here was that I guess I made the mistake of getting on Reddit, and I never really got on Reddit, looked at forums on there, especially related to philosophy, but I did, and I came across a few with the concept or the title of philosophical pessimism. But you read those opinions, and it's just gloominess about life, right? But there's nothing particularly philosophical about it. So I thought maybe it would be helpful to say, what would make pessimism philosophical, as opposed to just, an opinion. So we'll start with that. There's a classic illustrative example, you've probably heard it, to illustrate pessimism, or the difference between pessimism and optimism. And it involves two people looking at the same glass filled halfway with water, right? You've heard it before. One of them, the optimist, says, "Oh, great, it's half full." And the other, the pessimist, he says, "Oh, no, it's half empty." The two parties, in this case, they agree on the facts. They just evaluate those facts differently. Importantly, though, in this case, there is nothing in the objective world to which we can point to say who's right. No one is, or they both are, right? The point is that the disagreement between the optimist and the pessimist in this case, it's a matter of subjective opinion rather than a disagreement about the nature of reality. In other words, it's not a philosophical disagreement. And the pessimist, in this case, he's not making a philosophical statement, right? So if there is a case to be made for pessimism as a philosophical position, then it's an evaluation of facts that cannot plausibly be evaluated in positive terms, right? It's not a matter of opinion. Philosophical pessimism is grounded in the nature of a terrible reality. So it's the task of the philosophical pessimist, for example, Schopenhauer, who we'll talk about today. It's the task of that philosophical pessimist to ground his grim views in the nature of reality. And that's exactly what Schopenhauer attempts to do. He argues that no life is worthwhile, and that it would have been better if life had never come into existence. Those are pessimistic claims, right? But what makes those claims philosophical is that he provides arguments that ground those claims in the nature of reality. And our question today is whether those arguments succeed, or if, in the end, even Schopenhauer, although he purports to be a philosophical pessimist, perhaps he too, at least in that regard, he was certainly a philosopher, there's no doubt about it, but at least with regard to his pessimism, perhaps that too is just a subjective opinion, right? So in this episode, we're going to see if he can ground that pessimism in the nature of reality. This is the second episode on Schopenhauer. I would say that you must have listened to the first, but I'll do a brief recap here in case you missed that one. But also, again, I think it's my fault. I've set this up weird, right? This should have been one long episode on Schopenhauer, but I broke it up into two parts, and I kind of did it in this weird way. So you can think of this as the main episode on Schopenhauer, and the first one as a sort of precursor and introduction to the idea of life denial as it relates to Schopenhauer's philosophy. But in this one, we're going to go much deeper into Schopenhauer's metaphysics, and as I said, see how he grounds his pessimism in his metaphysical claims. Okay, but as I said, we'll do a brief recap here. So Schopenhauer describes humans as willing beings. Willing or striving, he argues, is essential to life. And as we'll see, he thinks actually the willing just is the nature of reality. But as applied to us, he argues that we are always and everywhere striving for something. He thinks that's the fundamental characteristic of human life. As he puts it in The World as Will and Representation, the life of man with its endless care, want, and suffering is to be regarded as the concretion of 1,000-fold wants and desires. End quote. right? We come out of the womb and instantly we are wanting things. We are willing things. We want the comfort of our mother. We want food. We want to be relieved of discomfort and so on. And we grow older. Our desires change, but our lives can still be characterized in terms of desire. We want different things. We want to acquire different things. We want to achieve different things. But in a word, we are still willing. But this willing, Schopenhauer says, is a problem for us. In fact, it is the problem, the cause of our suffering. Insofar as we will a thing, we don't have it. We are in a state of deprivation. We don't have what we want or need, and in this sense, we suffer. But the news gets worse, according to Schopenhauer, because once we finally do get what we want, we are soon either overwhelmed with boredom, because what we wanted, it turns out, is not so great, or we're overwhelmed by a new desire, and the race starts over again. And in this way, Schopenhauer says, quote, life swings to and fro like a pendulum between suffering and boredom. So thoroughly are we willing beings, and so insufficient is the world we inhabit to satisfy that will, that we are forever in the throes of desires, and therefore forever suffering. We live and strive in a material world that can never fully quench our thirst. Forever, in this way, are we lost in the desert. So, life consists of perpetual suffering, punctuated here and there by brief bouts of joy that quickly turn to boredom, and therefore it is bad. Life is bad. It's something to escape if we can. The good news, if you can call it that, is that you can escape, according to Schopenhauer, but only by denying the will, by starving desire until it wilts and perishes, leaving one at peace in a will-less existence in, as he puts it somewhere, the calm beyond the storm of desire and willing and striving, right? Those who have achieved such willlessness, they include, some of the ascetics that we looked at last time, the Jainist monks perhaps Saint Simeon, the Christian ascetic of the 5th century who sat atop a pillar for 37 years fasting and praying until his death. And perhaps even some of the more extreme Buddhists would fit into this category, right? Schopenhauer was certainly a fan of both Hinduism and Buddhism. These ascetics, they renounce the will, they deny the world. And in the last episode, we asked if Schopenhauer's general description of life in terms of willing as suffering, we just asked in general, does that sound right? And in the process of that, we identified a problem for Schopenhauer. The problem of the happy man, the man who, though he hasn't evaded all suffering, though he is, let's say he's even suffered a lot, looks upon his life at the end, and after honest reflection says, you know what? If life is willing, then the will has been good to me, right? On the whole, it was worth it. I've loved my life, and I found it generally worthwhile, right? And the idea of the happy man is just meant to represent the general common sense view that some lives are worth living, even if some aren't. And we ended the last episode by pointing out that to address this problem of the optimist, the happy man, Schopenhauer must say that he's either delusional or dishonest. But the charge of dishonesty, at least at initial first pass, it just seems to ring hollow, right? Schopenhauer wants to say, well, you're just not being honest about your experience of life. But, it's not at all implausible that one might honestly approve of his life on the whole. I feel like I've known such people. I'm sure you do too. I hope to be one of those people, right, that can look back on my life and say, that's worthwhile, right? And I don't want to over-trivialize this. It's been a long time since I looked at these studies, maybe 10 years ago, but I did see a study. This was more about future looking, that the conclusion of the study was that people tend to to analyze their future or conceive of their future in overly optimistic terms. And now that I'll have to go back and look at that, because I don't think it was like a long-term study. And if it wasn't a long-term study, we don't know how things actually did turn out for the people in the study. And so you've got these researchers and they're, the people taking part in the study, are saying, that they will have a good future. The researchers are saying, yo, you sorry saps. Like, you have no idea how bad it's going to be for you, which is funny. And I'm sure they were looking at stats like, 2 of you are going to get cancer and 3 of you are going to die in a car crash or, whatever it is. But it's funny to think of it that way, right? And I mean, not just to think of it that way, that is what was going on. They're saying, you sorry saps, like, you have no idea how awful your life is going to be. Anyway, okay. I would have to see something much more robust than that, about, looking at our life in retrospective terms. And, it would take a lot to convince me that there's just no way that we can do that honestly. I'm also just not convinced, like I'm sure a lot of people aren't, that, the idea of having a good life is so far-fetched, right? In fact, I think the common sense view is that it is possible to live a good life, even if the common sense view is, a little overly optimistic or naively optimistic about how difficult that is, right? So if Schopenhauer can't say that that the happy man is dishonest, that the optimist is just being dishonest, then he has to describe how he's delusional. And today we're asking if he can make that case. He has to point to the facts of the world that show that the happy man's optimistic assessment constitutes delusion. And thereby he would place his own pessimistic assessment on philosophical grounds. So today we're asking, can he do that? Does Schopenhauer make his case well? Is pessimism, or at least Schopenhauer's pessimism, is it indeed philosophical and not just a subjective evaluation of things in negative terms? A subjective evaluation of things that could just as well be evaluated by an optimist in positive terms without delusion, right? So, okay, so now we get into the metaphysics. So I just said that, Schopenhauer's case that the happy man is delusional rests on metaphysical grounds. What that means is that Schopenhauer takes himself to have established what the essence of reality is. What is the nature of things apart from how you or I or anyone else experiences it? Now, that's a bold claim, right? That's part of what I think makes Schopenhauer so fun to read. He really does take himself to have solved the ancient riddle. So when I say that Schopenhauer was convinced that the happy man was delusional, I mean quite literally that he took himself to know exactly what reality is. And insofar as the happy man evaluates that reality optimistically, he's wrong. Okay. So the key to Schopenhauer's philosophy as a whole, as he says over and over and over again throughout the world as will and representation, is his idea that, or claim, that reality is the will. The same urge you feel when you want something, when you strive towards something, or even when you feel strong emotion towards or against something. For Schopenhauer, that is the inner essence of reality. The world just is this blind, aimless, irrational urging or striving towards nothing in particular for no reason in particular. So I'm sure that sounds like a wild claim to those of you who are unfamiliar with Schopenhauer. Maybe it sounds like a wild claim to those of you who are familiar with Schopenhauer. So how does he get there, right? Schopenhauer was quite heavily influenced by Kant. Really, that's an understatement. He agrees with much of what Kant has to say. So it's a good place to begin, at least a general overview of Schopenhauer's metaphysics. So there's an old question in philosophy, and perhaps it's, the most basic one. What is reality, right? Now, of course, that's a very broad question. But the motivation behind asking that question is that there are good reasons to question whether we have access to reality through our various modes of experience with the world. To take just a well-known and trivial example, although it's still interesting, is that we know that our experience of color, for example, is in certain respects deceptive. It is deceptive in the sense that, without thinking about it at least, Our experience of a green object may lead us to conclude that there is such a thing, a property, greenness out there in the world, in the sense that one could wipe out humanity totally and still there would be something green in the world, right? But that's not the case, right? Color it's a dispositional property. It's an interaction between our eyes and some property or set of properties in the world with the disposition to produce the experience of color or greenness when it interacts with our eyes and our various, psychophysiological makeup. But it's not out there in the world, greenness isn't, in the same way it exists in our minds. And as I said, knowing even just this, that wait a minute, I experience greenness, but greenness isn't in the world like it is in my head. This little fact lays the grounds for us to question much more about the relationship between our experience of the world and the world as it is in reality. It raises a more specific problem in philosophy, the relationship between appearance and reality. Now, that's not how Kant started off, right? I know that. We'd have to go back to Hume. I think even the Epicureans, right, well before Kant in Athens said that colors were dispositional properties, right? They may not know all the ins and outs like we do today, but they did say that. They realized that, colors weren't out there in the world, right? So I'm not saying that's what led Kant to, write the Critique of Pure Reason, right? He had other, the answer to that question has its roots in early modern philosophy. I know that. I'm just using it as an example to motivate the distinction between appearance and reality. The meat of Kant is that, according to him, colors are not the only features of our experience that don't directly reflect reality. In fact, none of it does, or at least we cannot know that any of it does. So for Kant, every aspect of the world you experience, your experience of the world as individuated objects extended in space and across time, or today we'd say in space-time, and as having causal relationships to one another, all of this experience is a result of the structure of the human mind. And we cannot know that the experience generated by the particular structure of our mind reflects the world as it is in itself. So for Kant, there is the world of phenomena, the world as we experience it, and then there's the world as it is in itself. And we are forever cut off from the world as it is in itself. We cannot escape the mind, as it were. We cannot crawl out of our minds to experience the world, nor can we employ empirical methods like science to bypass our minds and gain access to reality. The reason is that the principles and methods of science are devised according to the structures of our understanding. So, for example, science explains phenomena in terms of their causal relationships to one another. The problem is that even the principle of causality is a feature of the structure of our minds, and we don't know that the principle of causality applies to the world itself, right? So it's not just our experience of the world in terms of how things look and feel and sound and so on, but even the principles of our understanding of the world, the principles we use in abstract and empirical sciences, all of it is a result of the structure of our mind, and unable to escape those structures even in thought, right? Because we can't get out of our minds, we are left only to wonder at the way the world is in itself. So Kant's answer to the old philosophical question of what is reality, the answer is, well, we can never know. So Schopenhauer agrees with most of what led Kant to his conclusion. Transcendental idealism is what it's called. But he rejects certain aspects and he arrives at a different conclusion regarding the question of what reality is. He agrees that at least human interaction with the outside world amounts only to representations rather than direct access to reality. He agrees with that. Quote, "We know not a sun and an earth," he says, "but only an eye that sees the sun and a hand that feels the earth." End quote. And to be more accurate, you might say that one knows only a representation of the sun that results from the interaction of his psychophysiological structures and something beyond him, right? In other words, We know only representations generated by our psychophysiological structure, right? Where Schopenhauer disagrees with Kant's metaphysics concerns causality. And I know we're kind of getting deep into the woods here. But Schopenhauer says that Kant made a mistake in describing a relationship with reality as a causal interaction between reality out there and our representation, our experience of it. Remember, causality is only a feature of our understanding, even according to Kant. So Schopenhauer says that if it's a feature of our understanding, then we can't apply it to the thing in itself, which we do when we say that reality, the thing itself, causes our representation, and then treat the thing in itself, reality, as somehow a separate object from our representations, right? So the main point is that it's not that reality is somehow a totally separate thing from our experience, right? Rather, Schopenhauer says, the world of our representation is reality seen from a particular perspective. Still a perspective that we cannot escape, still a perspective that science can't crawl its way out of, still a perspective that we can't crawl our way out of in abstract thought. But it's a perspective of reality, or perspective on reality. It's not like reality is some separate thing behind the representations that we have zero interaction with. Okay, so more importantly, Schopenhauer thinks that actually there is one way that we can access reality. This isn't escaping the world of representations. We can't do that. Kant thought that we are forever cut off from the thing in itself, from reality as it is in itself. Schopenhauer pointed out that, hey, remember, you are an object in the world of representation, this world that you can't figure out the essence of. You are one of those objects. And, the problem with empirical science or empirical methods of trying to discover the nature of reality is that, they're stuck in the world of representation. They can't access the inside of the things that they're investigating. But again, you are one of those objects, Schopenhauer says. And guess what? You can experience at least that one thing yourself from the inside, right? So when I look at my hands, they're an object in the world of representation, just like the rest of the objects that I want to know the fundamental nature of. But unlike the other objects, I have direct experience from the inside of this body, the one that I see in the mirror and treat as an object in the world of representation. Well, guess what? That's me, right? And I experience it from the inside. And if I'm trying to identify the most fundamental aspect of that experience from the inside, it's will, or it's just the basic urge towards things or away from things, the urge or force at the bottom of my experience that motivates all of my actions and it's the determining standard of my feelings, right? Something goes with my will, with what I want, then I feel good. If it's against it, then I feel bad, right? So this willing, this urge towards or away from things, Schopenhauer says, this is what constitutes our experience of our own bodies from the inside. And absent any good evidence to think that fundamental reality is something other than what our access to this one object tells us, we have no better theory than to say that, well, I suppose the inside of all of these objects in the world is will, right? Again, we're never going to get beyond representation to discover the nature of things beyond us, but we do have experience of ourselves as one of those objects in the world, and this experience of willing, that is the experience of willing, and so the world is will. And that's it in a nutshell. There are many questions one could ask about that, right? Why is the basic urge behind our actions and experience the most fundamental thing of our subjective experience, right? Why not consciousness itself, right? Why don't we say, like the panpsychists do, like Philip Goff, a contemporary, does, that fundamental reality is consciousness rather than will, right? And I don't want to get sidetracked here, but it's a legitimate question worth diving into. In any case, Schopenhauer does think the world is will, and what that amounts to is a picture of reality as fundamentally an irrational urge or will, eternally striving towards nothing in particular for no particular meaning at all, right? And that will manifest itself in the world of representation, the world of our experience, as the manifold reality we know. That's Schopenhauer's metaphysics. Again, I could talk about it all day, but that's it in a nutshell. And, it's enough to make sense of the relationship between Schopenhauer's pessimism and his metaphysics. So, Schopenhauer's pessimism, the idea that life is not worthwhile and that life as a general phenomenon is a bad thing, it's grounded in this metaphysical view of the world as will, right? The world is will, and what do we know about the will through life, right? Through our experience. And this is where things get gloomy, right? What is the will? It's striving. What's striving? Well, it's directedness towards something we want, something that we don't have, something we are deprived of. And since it involves this deprivation, it is suffering. And since we are always willing or bored if it momentarily stops, we are always suffering because the world offers nothing to satisfy us, right? And this is an important point. It's not that something could theoretically satisfy us, but the world happens not to have that thing. No. If what we are is willing through and through, and willing amounts to suffering, then nothing even could potentially quench our thirst, right? Right? Where there is willing, there is suffering. If life is willing, then life is necessarily suffering, right? That's Schopenhauer's a priori argument from the metaphysical fact, or supposedly a priori argument. We'll question that later. From the metaphysical fact that the world is will to the conclusion that life is suffering, no good, and something that ought not be. I should also note that there's a bit of a tension here, and maybe it's just a superficial tension. He's got some interesting things to say about it, but at least there is at least a superficial tension here for Schopenhauer. If we are essentially the will, then if it's truly our essence at the fundamental level, well, remember from the last episode that the only route to salvation or to the cessation of this suffering, since it cannot be satisfied in life, is to deny it, to kill it, by extreme, not suicide, but by extreme ascetic practices, right? We kill the will by eliminating desire, thereby putting out the fire of desire, right? So if willing is our essence, if that's what we are, and salvation consists of transcending this human reality, becoming non-willing, right? The tension is just, well, if everything is will, how is that possible, right? If everything is will, then how do we become not will, right? He has some interesting things to say about that again, but it is at least a superficial tension. Okay, so back to the main question with which we began this episode. Is the optimist delusional? Well, Schopenhauer says, yeah, he is. He's delusional insofar as he fails to comprehend the tragic essence of the world, that it is willing and therefore suffering. And so long as the optimist denies that, he is delusional and not merely, well, he's soothing himself, lying to himself about his experience. He must be, right? So for Schopenhauer, he is both dishonest and delusional, right? We have reason to question the dishonesty charge, but I think the reason that we question the dishonesty charge is that we actually question Schopenhauer's description of what willing is. So again, this is sort of my fault. I've set up things strangely with the last episode. I should have just had one long episode. But the truth is we've already dealt with this argument. And now we have a fuller understanding of how the argument is rooted in his metaphysics and not just some assertion that Schopenhauer made. But we dealt with this argument last time. The problem for Schopenhauer is in his analysis of what willing is, right? He says that reality is will. Okay, let's just accept that for the sake of argument. But what is willing? He says that it is suffering because it involves deprivation, and deprivation is suffering. But that last bit, that deprivation is always and everywhere suffering, that's a claim about experience, right? And it's not an a priori claim. And our experience of willing just isn't always that it's suffering, or that it is always and everywhere suffering. Sometimes willing towards something that one values is generally a good experience, right? And even when it isn't, this is important, even when it isn't, so long as we do value the end, we might still look back on the process and say that it was good, right? It was worth it. And if we are lucky enough to be able to fill much of our lives with worthwhile striving, as surely some people do, well, then such a person can plausibly say that a life of a willing being isn't necessarily always suffering, such that at least some people can be optimistic about their lives. And sure, there is no final satisfaction if we are willing beings, but who's to say that final satisfaction is really what we want anyway? If we are willing beings, maybe what we want is to will or strive towards ends that we value, right? So that's important. If willing isn't necessarily suffering, then it is in some sense up to our circumstances and even up to us, not in a free will sense, but up to us in the sense that we can, freely or not, devote ourselves to projects that we find valuable. Right, but that means that happiness is possible, or at least happiness that is appropriate for a willing being in a material world, right? If you define happiness as final satisfaction of the will, then sure, happiness is impossible because willing is, an eternal thing, or at least a persistent thing in the human life, right? But why should we define happiness that way? Why should we set the standard for happiness beyond the possibilities in this world, right? I'm not sure that there's a good justification for that. If you start with different premises, right? For example, happiness or total fulfillment in the Christian sense is being united with God, right? But in the Christian narrative, in the Christian worldview, we are ensouled beings, and our souls are longing for God, right? We're not willing creatures, right? Whose essence is a meaningless urge, right? So, you might define happiness differently depending on your starting points and your philosophical assumptions or conclusions, right? But apart from the Christian narrative, if we are willing beings, in Schopenhauer's world, if we are willing beings, why define happiness, in terms that are beyond the pale of possibilities for humans? You don't have to do that, is all I'm saying. Okay, so it's also worth saying that's good news, right? It's good news if Schopenhauer is wrong. I feel funny saying that, but if you read Schopenhauer, he's such a beautiful writer, a moving writer, and a convincing one, that you kind of get sucked into his way of seeing things, and you kind of start to enjoy it, right? You enjoy the gloominess of it. And, I think this is one reason, anyway, why he's so popular with artists, right? Plenty of artists have gotten caught up in Schopenhauer's web. And the reason, again, is that he is so moving and convincing of a writer, and the world the atmosphere that you're swimming in Schopenhauer, you can start to enjoy it in spite of the gloominess, or even, because of it. But, at the end of the day, it's a good thing if he's wrong, because there is no hope in Schopenhauer, right? There's escape through salvation, but there's no hope, right? Even you're escaping something bad, you don't gain something good, right? I understand that, the bliss of an enlightened person, right? An ascetic person. I can't speak to that personally, but on Schopenhauer's worldview, you're escaping something bad, but you're not uniting with God or uniting with something good, right? Remember, the will is just a blind urge, aimlessly striving towards nothing in particular for no meaning, or for no reason at all, right? So there is no hope in Schopenhauer. So if he's wrong, it's a good thing, because then there is hope, right? Okay. So it's important, though, not to mistake my point here, right? I'm not saying that life is good, right? I'm making the modest but forceful, I think, claim that life isn't necessarily always and everywhere suffering, such that no life is possibly worthwhile. The difference between the optimist and the pessimist isn't necessarily binary, right? One can not be a pessimist in the absolute and universal Schopenhauerian sense, but still accuse certain types of optimism as naive to the amount of suffering in the world, and as naive with respect to the difficulty of a good and worthwhile life, right? Trust me, I don't have the life is good sticker on my car, right? When I was a thoroughgoing Schopenhauerian, that sticker used to piss me off, as silly as that is, right? That's a sign that potentially, one spends a little too much time in the books, right? But my reaction was sincere, and it was basically that, you're a naive prick who's blind to the world's misery, when in fact it's probably not that, right? They're probably not a prick. It's probably a thoughtless attempt to convince oneself that, in fact, one is one of the lucky few who does, in fact, have a good life. And in some of those cases, they may be right, right? I still think it's potentially insulting to people who are going through something, but I suppose it's, a sticker that says my life is good that qualifies it. That wouldn't come that wouldn't come across well either, right? So whatever, it's just a sticker. That's what I tell myself these days. Let the people have their stickers. Okay. But there's another element to Schopenhauer's pessimism, right? We're not totally out yet. To harken back to what I said a few minutes ago about, perhaps not staying in Schopenhauer's waters too long, right? Nietzsche has a great way of putting that you should treat pessimism like an ice bath, quickly in, quickly out. Well, we're not out yet. Because so far we've been concerned with pessimism about individual lives. But what about Schopenhauer's other claim? That the world ought not be, that it would have been better if life had never come into existence. These are claims about the general phenomenon of life, not about a particular individual life, right? One can be an optimist about his own life while still being a pessimist about life in general. He might think that his own life is quite good and worthwhile, and that Schopenhauer is wrong about the impossibility of a worthwhile life. But he also might think that many others aren't so lucky, that in fact the suffering in the world is on the whole somehow just not worth it, right? Not worth whatever good lives there are, value that life produces. He might think that despite the quality of his life and the lives of the lucky few, non-existence would still somehow be better. So we're not out of the woods yet, right, with Schopenhauer's pessimism, even if we've taken on the main thrust of it. So our question now is whether Schopenhauer's global pessimism about life as a general phenomenon is true in an objective sense. Can he make that case for philosophical pessimism? Okay, so Schopenhauer claims in many different places and in a few different ways that, in short, our world ought not be. Sometimes he expresses it just like that, our world ought not be, but other times he states it comparatively to the effect that it would have been better if life had never come into existence. And sometimes he even makes the same claim in both ways in the same passage, right? Here's just one example of him making that claim. If you try to imagine, he says, as nearly as you can, what an amount of misery, pain, and suffering of every kind the sun shines upon in its course, you will admit that it would be much better if, on the earth as little as on the moon, the sun were able to call forth the phenomenon of life, and if here as there, the surface were still in a crystalline state. Okay, so an important note up front. Since Schopenhauer took himself to have established pessimism about all individual lives in the nature of reality, he doesn't take up the case of the general phenomenon of life separately, right? Because it's easy to get, if you've established that no life can be worthwhile, it's easy to get from there to the claim that life as a general phenomenon is not worthwhile, right? Only here and there does he offer an argument that one can separate from the general argument for pessimism about life that we looked at earlier. But he does here and there, and in the following passage, I think he gives us his most compelling one and his most straightforward one. This is from a supplementary essay entitled On the Vanity and Suffering in Life from the second volume of World as Will and Representation. Quote, "It is superfluous to dispute whether there is more good or evil in the world, for the mere existence of evil decides the matter, since evil can never be wiped off and consequently can never be balanced by the good that exists along with or after it. That thousands had lived in happiness and joy would never do away with the anguish and death agony of one individual, and just as little does my present well-being undo my previous sufferings. Therefore, were the evil in the world even 100 times less than it is, its mere existence would still be sufficient to establish a truth that may be expressed in various ways, although always only somewhat indirectly, namely that we have not to be pleased but rather sorry about the existence of the world, that its non-existence would be preferable to its existence, that it is something which at bottom ought not be, and so on." End quote. Okay, there are several interesting aspects to that passage, the first of which is that Schopenhauer says right up front that he's not making the common argument that one hears for this general type of pessimism, right? That common argument is that it is the amount of evil in the world that renders its non-existence preferable, right? That isn't to say that the amount of evil in the world isn't relevant to an assessment of life, right? Schopenhauer regularly invokes the amount of evil in the world. He says that, if you were to drag the optimist through torture chambers and psych wards and places of misery, he might change his mind. But here he says that ultimately it doesn't matter how much evil is in the world. The mere existence of evil decides the matter, right? The fact that evil exists at all decides the matter that the world ought not be, right? So he's not saying, that you can put evil on one side of the scales and happiness and joy and value on the other side of the scales and sort of measure which one comes out on top. He's saying that that's superfluous. It's superfluous because the mere existence of evil decides the matter. Okay, so I do want to spend a little bit of time with that argument that Schopenhauer says he's not giving, because I think it's important to understand why it doesn't work before we go on and try to make sense of the argument that Schopenhauer does give. So we'll call that argument the common argument, where you sort of balance evil and good. We'll call that the balance argument. And according to the balance argument, there is so much more suffering in the world than there is happiness or value or joy, so much more bad than good, that on balance, the good things involved in the phenomenon of life are not worth the bad, and therefore it would have been better if life had never come into existence. Okay, so there are a few ways to see why it doesn't work. One is that it purports to be an arithmetic argument or a quantitative argument, right? But there just is no empirical basis for the quantities it purports to use, right? So it's not as if, if somebody gets stabbed in the neck on the sidewalk, that at the crime scene, somebody can come by and pick up these sort of misery pebbles, right, that represent the amount of misery that just happened, and put them on the scales. And it's not as if, a happy child playing with their kite in a field leaves behind little happiness pebbles that they could take and put on the other side of the scales. And then you take all of those for everything that's ever happened on Earth, and you put them on the scales, and you see which way the scales are leaning, right? There just is, how do you quantify the joy of a grandfather watching his grandchildren play, wanting nothing more than to be in that moment and watch his children play? How do you quantify that versus the miseries of war, right? How many points does each of those get? Right? These aren't empirical questions that we can go out and test for and, just add up the quantities at the end and see which one comes out on top, right? So it purports to be this arithmetic argument, but it has no empirical basis for the quantities that it intends to use, right, or that it would need to use in order to make the argument. Another way of seeing why it doesn't work is to, analyze this concept of worth or value, right? When one says that the good in life in general, right, the general phenomenon of life, if the good in that general phenomenon is not worth the bad, right? When someone says that, what does the term worth mean in that context, right? When someone says, think of it this way, when someone says or asks, what's that share worth? And someone says, oh, it's worth $10. And, that person says, okay, I'll take it. You understand what that means, worth, in that context. The measure of value there is the marketplace of chairs, right? That's the measure of value. And it either makes sense against that marketplace or it doesn't, right? If the chair was, $7,000 and it's just a run-of-the-mill chair, you say, no, it's not worth that, right? And you're having an objective argument there, right? Compared to the marketplace of chairs, that chair is not worth $7,000. It is worth $10, right? Another example, let's say someone's climbing a mountain and they lose a finger on their way up, but they make it up anyway. And then at the end of it, you ask them, hey, was it worth it? And they say, yeah, it was worth it. Well, what's the measure of value there? It's that person's own experience and his judgment. In that case, you're asking the subject, right, what his opinion is about his experience. And he's telling you, right, the measure of value is his experience and judgment. It's his experience and the judgment he makes on it, right? You have no reason to question that. You might, if he's being dishonest or something, he's a liar or he has a reason to say it was better than it was, right? But in general, right, you have no reason to question him. So the concept of worth makes sense in those contexts, right? But when you say the good is not worth the bad in the general phenomenon of life, what is the what's the measure of value there, right? You could say it's not worth it to you or according to you, right? But we're not asking you. We're asking what the objective answer is. And maybe this, it's starting to become clear, right? It doesn't make sense, right? We would need either an objective measure of value that we can't get because we can't quantify pleasures and pains and value, or the lack thereof in quantitative terms. We would either need that or a third person, a God's eye view. We could ask, is it worth it according to God, right? But unfortunately, we can't ask him. So the question, does it make sense for a human to ask and a human to answer, right? Because there is no objective measure of value to employ to give an answer, right? George Simmel, in his book Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, he puts it this way. He says that, saying life as a general phenomenon is bad. It's kind of like saying that the human is tall, right? Now, we understand what that means when we're talking about a particular human, right? But the measure against which his height is determined as big or tall or short is the average height of the human being, right? But it makes no sense to ask whether the human in general is tall or short unless you're comparing him to another species or something like that, right? But to assess the height of the general phenomenon of human beings or humanity as such, right, it makes no sense because you have no measure against which to determine the answer, right? So that's why that doesn't work. Right. So now let's get to the argument that Schopenhauer does give. And I think this is where things get, most interesting. He says that it is, again, the mere existence of evil decides the matter that the world ought not be. And the reason he says that is that he says evil cannot be abolished. It can never be abolished, and therefore it can't be compensated for. So what does that mean? Well, if he's saying that evil must be abolished for it to be compensated for, he is saying that the reason it can't be abolished is that once it happens, you can't go back in time and undo it, right? And, I think importantly, sometimes we do talk like this. We ascribe this kind of absolute weight to evil. If, for example, I do something absolutely terrible to someone, and then later I try to make it up for it to them, what's the first thing I'll say? I'll say, look, I know that I can't make this up to you, right? But I hope what I'm about to do pushes things in that direction, right? Well, I mean, you're ascribing a weight to that evil, that harm done, such that it can never be made up for, or balanced, or compensated for. And there's this intuition that the only way I could, get abolished or compensate for it is to somehow undo it, right? And again, we talk like that. We say, I know I can't undo what I've done, right? So, the idea has some intuitive appeal. The problem with it, and, I would say that I'm trying to be charitable here, but that would be an understatement. For a long time, I read this passage and other similar passage in Schopenhauer. I said, yeah, that's right, right? And by the way, Ivan, the character in Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov, he says the same thing. He makes the same case to Alyosha in the Rebellion chapter. Right? I'm not saying this is what Dostoevsky thought. The brilliance of Dostoevsky is that he's able to hold the perspectives of Ivan, of Alyosha, of Father Zosima in his head all at once, right? But Ivan, a character in the novel, he says to Alyosha, he goes through various cases of child suffering or torture that apparently Dostoevsky got from newspaper clippings. So that they actually happened. But even if that's not true and they didn't happen, you could easily imagine such things happening in our world. You probably have your own stories to supply here. But one such story that he gives is the story of a child who accidentally hurts a general's dog's paw, and the general has the child devoured alive in front of his mother and in front of a bunch of other people, and that was his punishment. And Ivan says, what could possibly make up for that, right? The general discussion is about, whether God would create a world in which this would happen. And Ivan says, even if in the end the lions lie down with the lambs, and even if there's some great harmony, even if justice is somehow restored in a balance, that's the idea he rejects. Even if there is a heaven and a hell, and the general goes to hell, or the mother or the child himself is able to forgive the general, what does that do to abolish the evil that happened with the child, right? That happened to the child? How can that be made up for by some future harmony? And the general idea here is, in both Ivan's case and I think Schopenhauer's, is that evil has this weight to it, this absolute weight, such that once it happens, the world in which it happens is unjust, right? When evil occurs, it is a stain on the world such that can't be removed, such that the world is an unjust place. And whatever happens after that still happened. It's still an unjust place, because in a just world, that would never happen. Okay? So I think that is an intuitive idea. The problem is justifying it on philosophical grounds, right? I think this is one of those bedrock moral intuitions that philosophy can't justify further, right? In fact, George Simmel, the Schopenhauer and Nietzsche scholar, he says that this particular point is one to be appreciated but not criticized. And I think what he's saying there is that it's one of these intuitions, these moral intuitions, that you can't justify on further philosophical grounds. It's a bedrock intuition. And, the difficulty with that is that other people might disagree, right? Even in the Brothers Karamazov, he says, Ivan says to Alyosha, he kind of pumps his moral intuition and says, would you create that world? And Alyosha is kind of forced to say in that moment that he wouldn't. But other people are willing to accept that, right? Other people are willing to accept that, in the end, if justice is restored, then that is a just world, right? And the question is, how do you decide between those two intuitions that either evil has this absolute weight to it, such that it cannot be compensated for, or it doesn't? And so long as things work out in a particular harmonious way in the end, maybe that is a just world. Maybe there is redemption, right? How do you decide between those two? I'm not sure that you can on philosophical grounds. And, so this, I hate to end with this kind of conclusion, but it is where the reasons take us, that Schopenhauer's pessimism about the general phenomenon of life. I think George Simmel, again, I know I keep citing him, but to my mind, he goes deeper than the other Schopenhauer scholars on these particular subjects anyway. He puts it best when he says that in the end, the stand for the value or for the lack of value of existence depends in resolute and principled natures on the specific reaction their innermost soul exhibits to happiness or suffering. And, that's basically saying it's not necessarily unphilosophical in the sense that you can't defend it to a degree on philosophical grounds, but there is a point at which you cannot go any further. And since it is a point that admits of reasonable disagreement and there's no way to decide between the two, then it's at least on philosophically unstable grounds, right? So maybe that's not satisfying, but that's where we wound up. Importantly, it's not. You don't want to just say, okay, well, I have this bedrock moral intuition. The point is that, if someone disagrees with you and they're not totally insane, maybe they are, but if they're not totally insane, then there's a chance that you could come to see things differently, right? So the inquiry doesn't stop. And if there was a motivation to see things differently, then perhaps you could, sort of coax yourself into that, right? These themes are William James in The Will to Believe. He talks about this this type of method of willing yourself to believe certain things by, going back to what I said earlier, swimming in a different atmosphere. Okay, so inquiry does not stop. Hardly ever does. If you're expecting from a philosophy podcast or philosophy book some final, certain, knockdown arguments with respect to substantial philosophical questions, guess what? You're not going to get it. Okay, so what's the upshot of all this? Well, it's important to say that, all I have talked about is Schopenhauer's pessimism in any detail in any way. We talked about his metaphysics, but not substantially. There's a lot of interest there. His ethics are interesting. We didn't talk much about that. We didn't talk really much about his concept of salvation and how that relates to Eastern practices. We just kind of touched on that. So there's a lot of interest in Schopenhauer. All I have said is that his case for saying that individuals can't have a worthwhile life is not a good one, right? But that's not to say he's not right about a lot of things. And one of the things he gets right, I think, is that we are willing beings, right? I think we should conceive of ourselves that way. And, I think he makes sense of the tragic character of humanity. And so again, I'm not, don't accuse me of naive optimism for saying that some people some of the time can have a worthwhile life, right? I think that Schopenhauer gets it right, that the nature of the world and the nature of human beings in the world is such that it is very difficult to live a worthwhile and good and happy life, right? And even if the individual gets everything right, as Aristotle, made note of too, tragedy can ruin your life, right? We're still vulnerable, even if we do everything right, pursue or will valuable ends. Well, you can still have your life wrecked, right? So it's an unfortunate state that we're in, and I think Schopenhauer does better than anyone make sense of that. And I think that it's all too often ignored, the vulnerabilities of humankind, and it's all too often glossed over in rosy, optimistic terms that at the end of the day is just bullshit. It's just bullshit. You can be hopeful and you can be strategic in creating for yourself a valuable life, right? But human beings are in a tragic situation, period. Right? There's no way around that, and no one does justice to that fact like Schopenhauer. So, okay. All right, as usual, everything that I'm saying can be read in transcript form on the website. I'll put that in the show notes. I'll put all the books that I referenced in the show notes. Hope you guys enjoyed. Next time, we're going to talk about David Benatar, who also thinks that life is bad. He's a contemporary South African philosopher who writes in the style of analytic philosophy. It makes it pretty easy to get to the crux of the issues, which I appreciate. And we'll see if he can make the case that life is bad. All right, we'll see you next time.